Hello, my name is Grace Van, and it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Finn Koepf. Sorry about my German pronunciation. Finn is a master's student at the Faculty of Forestry at UBC with a research focus on ecological processes of urban trees and their role in protecting urban populations from climate change. He has been involved in mapping and analyzing the urban forest on campus since 2020. What has really brought him to fame to the broader UBC community is his tree walks, as he has given many educational tree walks on campus to faculty, students, and visitors. I had the opportunity to be on one of Finn's tree walk last May, and I was thoroughly delighted by many of his fascinating tree stories that he has discovered through his work on campus. So today, Finn is not only gonna share some of these tree stories, but also is taking us through his personal journey at UBC so that we would get to know the storyteller as well. Please join me in welcoming Finn.
All right, well, yeah, thanks for the warm welcome. My name's Finn, and today I'm going to be going through a couple of trees that I've discovered on campus as part of my tree walks and also as part of my work and research, various projects. I want to focus specifically on how we can use trees as a tool for storytelling and kind of really reflect on the power of storytelling and how we can use stories to convey information and knowledge to a diverse set of listeners. So yeah, we're going to be covering a couple of different topics. So we're going to start with a bit of a background. And normally during tree walks, they're roughly about 2 hours, and it's a long walk across campus, and we stop at each tree that I choose before, and then I tell people about the tree and some stories, and then we end up walking. Today we won't be walking that much, so it's going to be a lot of just talking. So I kind of tried to change the format up a little bit. So we're going to be covering a couple of core concepts that I want to go over. And for each concept, I have chosen one tree that's special here on campus that kind of really reflects that topic or that concept. And hopefully when we get to the end of it, which are a little bit more data heavy, forestry jargon, hopefully these stories and these example trees will kind of visualize those that data in a more digestible way and less boring way. So yeah, we're going to start off with the background, then we're going over my personal journey at UBC, then some of the projects and research that I've been a part of, and lastly some key takeaways and questions and my sources. So we already heard a short land acknowledgement, but one of the key things that I learned when coming to UBC and coming to Canada is that the context of truth and reconciliation is very important here. And it's also very important to me. I'm from Germany, so growing up, I didn't have that context. I never really thought about it. And when I moved to California when I was 15, I started hearing a little bit more and more about Indigenous history and specifically colonialism in North America. And then moving to Canada, I learned more and more about it. And I had the privilege to talk and meet many Indigenous students, faculty, and just genuinely great people, and got to learn a lot from them. So I think it's important to have a little bit of a longer land acknowledgement that isn't just a rehearsed 3 lines. So first, I'm going to start off by having a personal acknowledgement. As I said, I'm from Germany. Like, I am a settler here on this land, and I have benefited not only from the remnants of the colonial structures that I am even able to live here, but I've also benefited from an institution that is built on Musqueam land. And I personally also had, again, the privilege to learn from Indigenous people and learn about knowledge, traditional practices, uses of different plants that were often forbidden for the longest time. So the fact that I get to learn and benefit from these teachings is something that I really want to acknowledge, and it's special to me, and I'm never going to take it for granted. And the next part, after my little personal acknowledgement, I'd like to invite you to really visualize the land in this land acknowledgement. So if everybody wants to close their eyes, I want you all to envision UBC campus, Point Grey. And you can do this in any way you want. You can do it from a bird's eye view, you can do it from the street, but I really want you to try to visualize what the landscape looks like right now. And part by part, we're going to be changing the landscape with our imagination. So we now see huge skyscrapers and big buildings with many, many floors. I want you to now replace those with some of the biggest trees you've ever seen in your life. If you've ever seen a huge tree in your life, just think of a tree that's even bigger than that, okay? And that they're everywhere. And I want you to really imagine how these trees are reaching for the sky, kind of similar how the skyscrapers are on campus that we have right now. Next, I want you to envision all of the streets, the walkways, the paths with streaming students going to class. And I want you to replace those with actual streams and the sound of water, creeks, brooks. And I want you to envision many schools of fish, kind of similarly to the schools of students moving through these spaces. And lastly, where you're imagining and envisioning a bunch of bustling students that are all talking and excited, sharing knowledge and sharing stories, I want you to still imagine people walking around and doing that exact same thing, sharing stories, sharing knowledge, and learning from each other. Okay, so now that you've kind of envisioned that, was everyone able to kind of see it a little bit? Yeah. So I think that this is really important because often when we do a land acknowledgement, we kind of just go through the motions of it in the beginning of lectures or in the beginning of talks. And I think it's really important to actually visualize and truly, literally acknowledge the land that was here, that is here now, and that was here before. And I think one of the main importance of this is that we need to, well, we owe it, and we owe our respect to the people who came before us. And when we do it kind of half-heartedly, then we end up making mistakes that can be kind of embarrassing for ourselves. So actually kind of have a little bit of an example of that, but can anyone, I know that the resolution right now isn't the best, but can anyone point out an error with this sign that I discovered as part of my work on the northern side of campus? It's a Douglas fir sign, but can someone tell me what's wrong with that? Yeah, it is a little too small. Yeah. Okay, well, the picture of the twig is not a Douglas fir. So yeah, when we kind of do things a little bit half-heartedly, then we end up embarrassing ourselves a little bit. And I think we owe it not only to ourselves, but to those who came before to do these meaningfully and do it properly. Okay, so the first tree I chose to kind of bring these thoughts home a little bit is the old growth yew on campus. So nestled in the remnant forest behind Totem, there is a singular yew tree growing in a grove of Douglas fir and cedar, and it's a shade-tolerant understory species, which normally doesn't actually come out until very, very late in the successional stage of forests and silviculture. So those trees are often found in old growth forests, and they really thrive in very shaded understory settings with very slow growth patterns. They tend to stay kind of small for a very long time, but they grow incredibly old. The scientific name for the yew species that is native to British Columbia is Taxus brevifolia, and it has many uses in multiple First Nation cultures. Musqueam, as far as I know, has used almost every part of this tree species for different uses. So the wood was used for bows and paddles. The leaves, sap, and bark were for medicinal purposes. And somewhat recently, researchers actually found that there are anti-carcinogenic properties of in the oil that you can extract called Taxol, which is unique to this genus of tree. The the urban myth kind of is that this is the oldest tree on campus, although there is very little supporting evidence for this. A lot of forestry students kind of bring it up and keep on telling each other that it is an old growth tree and it is the oldest tree on campus, so that idea and that story has kind of solidified itself. So I like to talk about this tree not only because I think it's really interesting and it's a very cool like concept to have an old growth tree on a very urban campus. But if it's really an old growth tree, we're not entirely sure. But I like to refer to it as the old growth tree because I think it gives it a little bit more of a special side. And another reason why I want to talk about this tree is because of its cultural similarities to Taxus baccata. Taxus baccata is the yew species that is native to Europe, and it has very deep and old cultural ties in Germanic and Celtic cultures, pre-Christian cultures, where similarly to its Pacific counterpart, the wood was used for bows and oars, as well as the bark and the leaves and the fruit were used for medicine. But not only that, it also is a symbol for perseverance and immortality. The reason for this is because it is an old growth species, so it grows extremely old and it can be very resistant to a lot of disturbance. And when it grows really, really old, what happens is that it starts rotting at its center, and then new shoots from that same tree species will start growing inside there, protected by the surrounding wood and bark. And so at some point, when the exterior dies off, there's already a new yew tree growing from the inside. So it's kind of that cycle of death and rebirth. So it is a very, very special tree. And actually, in the village or in the town that my German side of my family is from, in Oberallgäu, there is what is believed to be the oldest tree in all of Germany. It's the Balderschwang Eibe. Eibe is the German word for yew. And it's estimated to be 2,000 to 4,000 years old. And I featured a picture of it looking quite majestic in the snow. And I really love these tree species. Whenever I see them back home in Germany, I take a second to just really look at it. And yew trees are deeply connected to the human experience, and there is a plethora of poetry. I mean, if you just Google yew tree poems, like you'll find 4 or 5 pages of all these different types of poems, and they're all really beautiful. So I really I invite you to look that up afterwards. Okay, so next, I want to talk a little bit about the history of tree walks. So normally when I do the tree walk, we all meet up at the green space or the lawn right by the reconciliation pole, and I kind of give the preamble and the introduction to what we're going to be doing. We're not really doing a tree walk today, but I still like to do this preamble. When I first started doing these tree walks, I wanted to know a little bit more on the background of them. I wanted to be able to tell students why we're doing this and since when humans have really been doing this. So I looked up the history of tree walks, and I was actually very surprised to know that it dates all the way back to the Socratic age in ancient Greece. So I used to be a philosophy student before I transferred to forestry, and so I was very happy to hear this because I had studied this history before. One of the very first recorded universities was the Academy, which was where Socrates and Plato taught their Socratic school of thought. However, Socrates and Plato got along quite well, but Plato's student Aristotle didn't really see eye to eye with him, and he kind of split off and wanted to do his own thing. So he went out to a grove of trees on the outskirts of Athens called the Lyceum, and he established his own school because building a huge temple is extremely expensive and not really feasible back then. He didn't really have a building, so he kind of just walked through the grove of trees with his students and pondered and talked about philosophy. So I really like this visual, and I think it's really cool because it kind of shows us that connection that we have to trees on an educational institution or in like an academic setting is as old as academia itself, really, if you think about it. I mean, it dates back all the way to the academy. so yeah, I think this is a really cool preamble to kind of see how us walking through the forest and being around trees when we discuss things is something that's very intrinsic to us, and we've been doing it for years or centuries, really. So yeah, and to kind of drive this point home a little bit and to continue with the ancient Greek setting, we have, in my opinion, the most special tree on UBC campus, which is the Hippocratic plane tree. Yeah, one day I was working on campus doing data collection, and I came across this tree with a little stone with a plaque on it. And on the plaque, it said that it was called a Hippocratic plane tree. And I was like, oh, I've never heard of this cultivar. What does this mean? But when I looked it up, it's not really necessarily a cultivar. It is a very special cutting from a tree from Greece. So on the island of Kos in Greece, there is a plane tree that is the direct descendant from the tree that Hippocrates taught medicine underneath in ancient Greece. And he taught his students below this tree and treated his patients. And unfortunately, that tree passed many years ago, but the island of Kos realized how special this tree was, so they planted a seed from it. So the daughter of that mother tree is now growing there. And the tourism board of Kos sends cuttings from this tree to universities and hospitals around the world so that everyone around the world can share that special connection to that tree. So these cuttings are direct descendants of the original tree in Greece. And so I was super interested in this tree, and during my work, I was approached by the editors of Branchline, which is the magazine in the forestry department. They have a section called Trees of Campus, and they go out and try to find very special trees to kind of write an article about. And they approached me and asked if I had any tree in mind. And as I had just discovered this tree, I said, I think you should include this one because it's pretty special and I don't think a lot of people know about it. And so I got into researching the tree a little bit more. And I kind of found out a bit more unfortunate things about the tree. So the tree originally came here with a professor, William Gibson. He brought the tree from Kos to Victoria first, and then started distributing smaller cuttings from it to university. I think St. John's Hospital has one too. So there's a couple, but another professor was involved in actually planting the seedling at UBC. This professor was named Dr. James Tyhurst, and I'm not going to go into exactly what this professor did, but I advise, if you're interested in looking it up on your own, I'm going to give a little bit of a trigger warning because it's not really all that wholesome, and I want to keep the vibes in here kind of wholesome. So yeah, it's a pretty dark history and there's pretty egregious acts committed by this professor. And I thought this was really sad because, I mean, this tree went through a journey that kind of rivals the Odyssey by Homer. It came from Greece all the way to North America, you know, centuries after being one of the most important trees to modern medicine. And then it was kind of muddied by a story from a subpar human. So that moment, I really realized how important it is that our stories and the stories of trees intertwine, and that any time that we have an interaction with a tree, those stories, they rub off not only on us, but also on, hopefully on the tree, maybe. But yeah, can't really ask them. So yeah, I think understanding how we interact with trees is really important because they kind of shape our stories, and they're very intertwined with many of your stories, I bet. If you think back, I think a lot of you have at least one or two memories, very fond memories that are somehow connected to nature, maybe even one specific special tree. Yeah, and so with that, I'm gonna go over my favorite story, which is my story. Yeah, so I grew up in Bavaria, which is southern Germany. The German equivalent of calling someone a wee little lad is kleiner Bub, and that's me as a kleiner Bub. I grew up with my oldest friend, Carla, who's my honorary older sister, and I grew up a lot in nature. That picture is me in an alpine meadow in Tyrol, and behind me is Der wilde Kaiser, which means the wild emperor. It's a mountain chain, part of the Tyrolean Alps, and it's a very special place to me. I grew up there, and I spent a lot of time outdoors as a kid, and I think that's a little bit where that connection to nature first started, subconsciously, even though I didn't really know much about forestry. So I grew up in Germany, but when I was 15, I moved to Los Angeles to take care of my grandfather. Um, that picture right there is me, my grandfather, my great aunt, and my dad. Um, I'm an avid skateboarder, and so I was very happy to move to California because there's a lot of skateboarding there. So that was me skating a road in Topanga Canyon, Malibu, which is a very famous road named Tuna Canyon Road. And a tree that I chose to kind of talk about my story is my very first encounter with an urban tree. This is when I was 4. I lived in Habsburger Straße, which is in a part in Munich called Schwabing. It's a very old part of the city, and we have a lot of green space that runs through the city. We have the English Garden, which is a green corridor that runs pretty much north to south through our city, along the Isar, which is the main river. And this park right here is the Leopold Park, and it's where my old kindergarten was. So I used to live just a block away and just would walk over and spend all my time in that park. I pretty much grew up in this park. They had everything there, a playground, basketball hoops, ping pong tables, climbing trees. And that kind of brings me to this one very specific tree, which is a Blutahorn. Ahorn is the German word for maple. We call it a blood maple, the specific cultivar. It is Acer pseudoplatanus atripurpureum. Purpur in German is like how you say burgundy or velvety. So that kind of describes the underside of these leaves. It's a cultivar that has really spectacular fall foliage, because not only does the upper side turn a new color, which are yellow, orange, reds, but the underside always stays this really vibrant purple. So in the fall, these are my favorite trees to watch, because when the wind hits them, I mean, they shimmer with like 100 colors. This specific tree that is right in front of that building there is the first urban tree that I had. And essentially the story goes is that I was climbing there with my friends. It's a really good climbing tree. So there, you got to imagine like 6 4-year-olds climbing through this tree. And we noticed that we were climbing it every single day and no one else was, and no one else was really using the tree. So why weren't we owning this tree? Like it should have been our tree. We didn't really understand ownership and urban forestry. We had no clue what that was. So we decided the best people to ask about ownership, and the people that would probably know, would be the university students that are walking past here. But to our disappointment, they had no clue, and we were shocked because we thought these were the smartest people in the city, and they didn't know who owns this tree and how we could get in contact with them. And we quickly realized that it might be a little bit more complicated than just asking someone. And we kind of gave up on that a little bit, but little did I know that in a couple of, or many, or 16 years, I would be the student that could have answered my question when I was 4. So that brings us to my first year at UBC and my introduction to the urban forest department and urban forestry as a practice. So again, I have some pictures. When I first moved here, I got to cross off an amazing road off of my bucket list. I got to skate it with my friends. It used to be part of the World Cup for downhill skateboard racing, and I had a really great time finally being able to skate it, knowing about it since I was probably 10. I also started to study more about plants and plant biology. I included a picture of a Douglas fir seedling that kind of is a little bit symbolic to me, because it's one of the first pictures I have on my phone of class course content of my undergrad. And it's also the very first true leaves that form in a Douglas fir. So I kind of liked that imagery. When I first moved here, I was really into hiking. I really loved the outdoors because, I mean, British Columbia is unlike any other place, really. So I was constantly out hiking up on Cypress Mountain or Golden Ears, where on a hike I met a lot of friends in the urban forestry department. It was the first time I actually went out with some new friends that I made at UBC. Also, within, I think the first 2 weeks of me moving here was the general climate strike right before COVID. And someone actually snapped a picture of me at the protest on my skateboard with my sign, and it got published in a tiny little magazine that I actually found in a cafe a couple of months later. And when I was flipping through it, I was, oh, that's me. Which I thought was really cool, so I included that as well. And on the very right is a picture of when I first joined the inventory project on campus. So we have a course on campus that measures all the trees in the academic campus core. I was enrolled in that course, and you can see me measuring a tree with some of my fellow classmates. And while I was enrolled in that class, we encountered a very special tree to me, which is the Sugi tree. This tree was the very first tree that I ever measured on campus. So it was very close to me. The Latin name for it is Cryptomeria japonica, but I kind of prefer one of the former Latin names, which is Cryptomeria kawaii, which means the cute Cryptomeria. Which I kind of like. I like having Latin names that aren't so serious. I like it when it's a little bit cutesy or fun, or there's a joke kind of involved in it. Yeah, so I didn't really know at the time that this tree was going to kind of be the start of my career throughout university, but I kind of knew that it was going to be a special tree slightly. Just looking at it as the tree that's located right next to the BD Biodiversity Museum. And it's really, really big. Kind of looks like a regular cedar, but when you come a little closer, you can see the differences. And the reason why this tree species is so special is because of multiple cultural meanings in Japan. So first off, it's integral to the Shinrin Yoku practice in Japan, which is forest bathing. It's kind of where that idea of forest bathing originated. And at first, people just thought that being in nature kind of gave people a sort of placebo effect of like, oh, I feel healthier, I feel mentally recharged, which is also true. Actually, actual exposure to greenery can be enough to really up your mood and make you feel more energized. However, researchers did discover that there was more than just this placebo effect. There's a volatile compound that is exuded through the bark of this tree species in particular that actually increases or boosts your immune system and increases your natural T killer cells in your body when inhaled. So this is an anti-carcinogenic tree. Essentially, it just produces anti-carcinogenic gas that you can inhale. So actually being close to this tree will physically heal you kind of and boost your immune system, which I thought was really interesting. The next practice that I think is really cool is called daisugi. It's a very unique silvicultural technique that I haven't really seen in a lot of other places. And daisugi translates to foundational or platform sugi. Essentially what happens is that the base of the tree is coppiced so that it creates a sort of flat platform, and then single spurs, single shoots at the top will assume apical dominance. So they'll think that they're the main leader and they'll grow straight up. But those shoots that are growing straight up, they almost grow knotless and perfectly straight. So when those grow really, really tall, at some point, they are then harvested, but only the top of the tree is harvested. So there's no uprooting. The soil stays the same and the understory stays the same. Only the top is taken off. And then that foundation grows new shoots. So it's kind of a silvicultural technique that lets us harvest timber without really tearing up the entire forest every single time we start a new rotation. Which I thought was really interesting. And I mean, the look of it is really, really cool. I really hope to see this in person one day. There's also a picture of the actual forest where all of the trees are using this daisugi method, and it looks incredible. I mean, it's super dense, but all of the timber is super, super thin and perfectly straight. And it's used often in the construction of ceremonial buildings, so tea houses and whatnot. And it's often used as the actual foundation, but not as much as like walling. It doesn't produce a lot of wood, but it is very rigid. All right, so after I took U4 220, which is the inventory course, I really wanted to work more with this project. It felt like a real project, not something that I just did for a semester. It felt like something I could really invest more time into. So I first joined by just cleaning data, which is just poring over Excel sheets, which after a while it gets kind of boring. But then slowly I got more and more involved with the team. I also joined the teaching team as a TA so that I got to actually learn how to teach this course. And there's multiple pictures, or there's some pictures of me joining the teaching team. This is with Dr. DeVischer, who still teaches the class. She's also my supervisor for my master's now. Next to her is Haiwan, Alex, and then me on the right. And on the very right, there's some pictures of us teaching the class, which was super fun. We get to be out in the field, which is great, and teach students really hands-on skills, something that is kind of was lacking before this course. So it teaches really, really important things, not just in the field, but how to synthesize data and how to produce real reports and present to stakeholders. It's one of the most useful classes in our degree, in my opinion. That's why I wanted to join it. You can also see some of the equipment that I used as a Trimble GX7, which is a GPS device that connects to satellites to give you pinpoint accurate GPS data of where the trees are on campus. So my job essentially was to go around, map the tree, identify the tree species, and then have that data ready for students to go out. So hopefully that's working. Yeah. So during this time when I joined the teaching team, as I said, I was poring over Excel data and it was starting to really get to me. I was closing my eyes and I could just see data going past my eyelids. I really hated it and I needed to get out. This was during COVID, so I couldn't really get to campus easily and consistently, but one day I decided it was really important to have one field day to do some ground proofing. And I decided to choose one tree species that I had noticed in the data sheet because I'd never recognized the Latin name before. And that is the Asunaro tree, which is Thuiopsis doliberata. It's a Japanese tree, again. And it's probably my favorite conifer species. I think when I looked up the name, because I wanted to know more about the species, I saw the leaves and the cones, and I knew I had to see this tree in person. I kind of couldn't believe how cool it looked. So I finally found it after like a full day of looking around and just having one line of data to finally figure out where this tree was. It's right next to the Hennings building by the Bosque on campus. And I was not disappointed when I saw the tree. I think it's one of the coolest looking trees. The leaves almost look like lizard or like dragon dinosaur scales. And the cones, they grow at the very end and turning into wood. It reminds me of my favorite dinosaur, which is the Ankylosaurus. It's the one with the big club on the back. I think it's really cool. And when you flip over the leaves, I wish you could tell a little bit more on the presentation, but every single one of the scales that are actually quite similar to a cedar tree has all of the stomata, which are the gas exchanging holes on the back, and they're bright white. So when you turn it around, you have these incredibly looking leaves that are also speckled with white. It's I've never seen a tree like it before, so I really wanted to share it. I also think that the name origin is really cool. So it comes from a saying in Japanese, and I might butcher this, but it goes, Asu wa hinoki ni naru, which means tomorrow it will be a hinoki cypress. The hinoki cypress is the more common, bigger conifer in Japan. So I think this is a pretty funny name. It's almost like it's teasing it a little bit. Like, one day when you grow up, you'll be a hinoki cypress. But I honestly think it shouldn't change. Like, it's perfect the way it is, and it doesn't really need to be a hinoki. And this name symbolizes ambition in students. Often the story of the Asunaro is told to students so that they thrive to be the best version of themselves and to be ambitious, which I think is really cool. All right, so after joining the teaching team, we were deciding on new things to add to the course, and we decided that the tree walks were a great way to show students kind of a unique perspective on trees that isn't just botanical jargon, which I love and students love, but not everyone does, and not everyone is super interested in it. So we were trying to figure out ways to make it a little bit more accessible, not only to students, but faculty and staff and other visitors of campus. So we kind of realized how important storytelling can be when visualizing data, or also just visualizing trees and making sure that we have some kind of connection to them and we care about them. And some of a great example of this is the Musqueam origin story, which goes that there is a two-headed serpent living within Camosun Bog, and in its wake, everything dies, essentially. It slithers through the forest and carves out these streams, essentially, where all vegetation, moss, and grass and soil kind of go away until it's just a bedrock, and then those streams start forming. So the streams that support the life of the Musqueam people were essentially created by the serpent. So often the Musqueam people refer to the bog as their origin point, or this serpent as their origin story. Again, to show kind of like how the indigenous North American culture and the old European culture aren't that different, is some of the most famous Germans, which are the Brothers Grimm. I think many of you know about it, but they traveled across Europe and collected stories and folklore from everywhere and wrote them down so that they could be shared with everyone. And a lot of the stories that my generation grew up with through Disney have all these stories that have come from the Brothers Grimm: Cinderella, Snow White. You know, there's so many. So having that storytelling aspect is really important, because stories are not only used to convey information or just for entertainment purposes, they often have some kind of meaning. They serve as a cautionary tale. So that twin serpent and those stories of Hansel and Gretel and children getting lost in the woods, and Little Red Riding Hood, those are all cautionary tales. So there's some parallels there. Yeah, and there's also some more pictures of previous tree walks that I've held, and more students ended up showing up, and we started broadening out. I did one for the biodiversity days where, yeah, Grace joined us, which was really, really fun. And there was more faculty and staff there. And then the most recent tree walk I did was for a human health research symposium, which was really cool. So I had to theme it, and I was talking all about human health and kind of talking about the effects of nature on human health and how we recover sometimes from disease or illness or injury, which I thought was really interesting. And the tree I chose to really show the importance of storytelling is called the upside down tree. I don't know if any of you have heard about this, but there is a tree on campus that is rumored to be upside down. So the scientific name of it is Ulmus glabra camperdowni. So it's an elm tree. And the story goes that there were a couple of students that were learning in plant biology about meristem cells and how the roots will always know where down is and the shoots will always know where the sun is. So they kind of meristem cells within the plant, they divide, and then they kind of assume a function, some kind of function. They end up as wood or as leaves, as chlorophyll, etc. The forestry students, they were curious, and they hypothesized that if you were to take a plant, because if you take a cutting from a plant and you put it in water, at some point it's going to grow roots, right? So something in the plant knows to create the right cells. So they hypothesized if you took a tree and you flipped it upside down and you put it back into the ground, the branches at some point would understand that they needed to be roots, and the roots would understand that they needed to be branches. So they did that. They took a tree and they flipped it upside down, planted it again, and it ended up looking horribly deformed. But so this is a myth that has been passed down within the forestry department, and it's something that I was told by my plant biology professor and by many other students, and I love keeping the story alive. I think it's so funny, because I mean, this would be a very unique study. I mean, I don't think this has been done before or ever tested. And if they did do this at a university, you'd think there'd be some kind of supporting paper. There's nothing out there. So that makes me believe that the other story about this tree species might be the real one. So the other story is that it's a cultivated mutation from Scotland. One day in roughly 1840s, the head forester of the Camperdown estate in Scotland was on a walk, and he found a tree that was horribly disformed. He was very curious. But because he was a botanist, he understood that this might be a naturally occurring mutation. He was really interested in this. So he took this tree and transplanted it onto the estate and tried to figure out if this was an inheritable trait, if you could pass down this mutation. So he tested this and you could. So each cutting from this tree would always produce this really, really weird branching structure that kind of didn't make sense and looked like roots. So knowing this, he had just discovered a cultivar essentially. He went to trademark the cultivar and registered it, and it still exists. That's why it's called Ulmus glabra camperdowni, because it's from the Camperdown estate. I kind of really like this tree because it shows how some of these stories may compete, and it shows how much value we place on a story that we like versus maybe a story that is the boring truth. And I really like to ask the students what they believe is the truth. And often we can believe in both stories, right? Like it's not really doing any harm. And it just means that we talk about this tree more and give it recognition, which I think is a great outcome. So I don't really care. I leave the choice to believe whatever story you want to you. I personally think it's the upside down tree. Okay, so this kind of concludes my journey at UBC, and the next part is going to go into a little bit more technical details of the research that I've been doing. So bear with me. I'm going to try to make this as interesting as possible and engaging. So during my undergrad in second year, I was living with two fellow students, Nick Mantegna and Ben Schufler. And both of these students are incredibly smart. And when we were living together during COVID, we would be taking our classes on Zoom all together and then immediately discussing things afterwards. And we were talking about a lot of the course content extracurricularly outside of the course. And one day, Nick had an incredible idea to look at how the green spaces on campus are connected to each other. So how are the green spaces distributed geographically, and how can we bring that connection together? Because when we compare traditional forests with urban forests, one of the main things that we realize, or that you'll notice, is the habitat matrix. Essentially, all the green infrastructure is kind of cut up with all the gray infrastructure, the buildings, the streets. It's not a continuous forest, right? So we need to understand how we can connect that forest past all of this gray infrastructure. So what he did is he looked at buffer sizes. Essentially, he looked at how far are green spaces apart from each other. And if they're close enough, he added a link, essentially. So that's why there's so many lines on this picture on the bottom right here. But essentially, each one of those links shows that two green spaces are close enough to be connected. So wildlife, seed dispersal, or a lot of ecological functions that we think of when we think of nature can function between those two green spaces. However, when green spaces are too far apart, we speak of dead zones. They're no longer connected to the greater matrix of habitat. So Nick's research was involved with that, figuring out the structural connectivity. And while I was researching different tree species and identifying all the trees on campus, I was a little bit more interested in the biodiversity, which we then realized was the functional connectivity. So not only where are those green spaces, but what is in those green spaces and what is actually committing all of these biological functions and ecological functions that we depend on. So I first did a biodiversity analysis. So I summarized all the tree species within each green space and came up with a diversity index, essentially, to kind of rank which green spaces were the most diverse. And then I combined it with the structural connectivity map to produce a structural connectivity potential map. Essentially what this does, this map, it identifies green spaces on campus that have great geographic location, meaning they're connected to all the green spaces around them. However, they lack biodiversity. There's no actual tree species or biodiversity in those green spaces to kind of take full advantage of their geographic position. So hopefully with this map, we can highlight areas on campus where we need to plant more trees, more diverse plants, so that more animals can actually access these green spaces. and have something to do there instead of just moving through them, right? So to kind of bring this point home a little bit, I want to compare two green spaces on campus that I think are on two opposite ends of the green space spectrum, what green spaces can essentially be. So the first one, which is on the top, is a tiny little square by the remnant forest, the totem remnant forest, and it is probably the most biodiverse green space on campus that I've found. Not only is it diverse in the sense of biodiversity, we quickly realized that diversity is something that is it's a multi-scale metric. It doesn't really only refer to the species that are there, but it refers to everything. Not only is it the species diversity, how many different species do we have? It also has to do with canopy stratification. How many age cohorts are there? Is the canopy all single aged? Are they the same height or are they kind of different? A lot of birds depend on this. There's birds that only really roost at the very top of canopies, while there's some that are in the understory. And also variable habitat, understanding that there's not only trees there, there's also bushes. And one thing that I think is a really cool design choice of this green space is in the front corner, there is a break in the curb that surrounds the green space, which means that during rain, all the runoff from the streets actually flows into this green space and it creates a little pond. And during the winter months, when it rains quite a lot, this is like a semi-aquatic habitat. And I've seen aquatic species in this little pond. So it essentially creates diverse habitat by just cutting a little bit out of a curb, which I think is really effective and really cool. It shows how minor design choices can really make a difference. So then comparing this to the Bosque, which I think most people might know, it's a pretty famous green space here on campus. It's right by the nest. It is essentially a grove of pin oak trees that is the most manufactured and man-made green space I think I've ever seen. It's really grows. It's I think 4 by 16 trees, and they're in perfect rows, and they're all the same age. They're all the same tree species, and there's nothing else. There's just grass underneath. And this green space actually was really popular back in the day. Before all of those pin oaks were there, there were only a couple of trees growing, and the inside of it was actually just a meadow. And it was one of the main hangout spots for students on campus because it was right where people come to campus, and everybody was hanging out on the old campus around IKB, Hennings, and the Nest. But nowadays, people don't really use it. I don't think I've ever seen someone in this green space for more than 2 minutes because people just walk through it. There isn't really anything there. You can't really go in the summer. It's shady, so you can't really just sunbathe and hang out. In the winter, it's really barren. It doesn't really look that nice. Also, puddles form because a lot of people just walk through it, so all the soil is compacted. And it's kind of one of our most famous green spaces on campus, but no one seems to use it, which I thought was kind of strange. There was a proposition for the extension of the Art Student Center. So it was going to be built on the Bosque, essentially, and a majority of those trees were going to be cut down. But there was such a huge backlash from students and such a resistance that UBC actually changed those plans, and they planned that building somewhere else. So it's no longer in the Bosque. It's right next to it, but none of those trees have been harmed or none of those trees have been cut down, which I thought was really interesting because why is there such major resistance about this green space, but no one actually uses this green space? I've never really seen anyone have that great of a time there or something, or there's not like a group of students that is known to hang out there. And that kind of showed me that even though we might not have the same context of a green space, me as a forestry student, I look at it and I immediately recognize the tree species and how it's planted and that it's kind of a manufactured green space and not really a natural one. But I still love that green space regardless because I love trees and I love nature. But even somebody who has no real knowledge of these tree species or green space design also has that love to it. I mean, students that weren't involved in urban forestry or forestry at all were protesting this construction project. So there is that innate love for trees. And cutting a tree down just feels wrong, plain wrong. I don't think there's something about it. I can't really pinpoint it, but I feel like it's almost a universal feeling of if there's a tree in our city and they're planning to cut it down, even if I know nothing about that tree, I don't want it to happen. All right, and lastly, I'm going to be talking about my last research project, which I started during my capstone and I'm now continuing in my master's, and that is quantifying ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are some of the benefits that humans derive from nature. There's many categories, but some of them are supporting ecosystem services like carbon sequestration and soil formation. There's regulating ecosystem services, which are shading, rainwater infiltration, things that kind of regulate natural systems. There's cultural ecosystem services, which are things that we get, such as recreation, or if there's a culturally significant tree. Some of the trees that I talked about before are providing cultural ecosystem services, such as the Hippocratic plane tree. And then there's also provisioning ecosystem services, which are actual goods that we derive from nature. That's like food and timber and things that are physical and that we use. I specifically wanted to look at regulating ecosystem services. Since I moved here, every single summer we've had heat domes, and almost every single winter we have some sort of atmospheric river or flooding somewhere in the Fraser Valley. So I thought those two ecosystem services were incredibly important and really interesting. So when I was conducting a literature review about how trees kind of influence their surroundings and the climate around them, I started figuring out ways to visualize this because I'm a very visual learner. I don't really do so well when it's just written out. So me and my fellow group mate in the capstone, we came up with this diorama where we kind of simulated a green space or simulated an urban setting with trees and then figured out how exactly these trees are influencing their environment. So what we found is that obviously each individual tree will shade and cool its environment. But not only that, when trees are close together and when they're bunched up, they create a microclimate, right? So they have exponential cooling. It's more than just the sum of its parts. So we thought that was really interesting. And we also identified areas where trees are close to buildings and they actually save energy costs for AC systems. So once we had identified all of those main functions, we put them together, and I realized that it looked like a GIS, or a geographic information system, something that I've been using a lot throughout my degree. Essentially, it's a computer model that can create any type of map, or it can convey any type of geographic information to answer a research question. And so I wanted to know which areas on campus, which green spaces on campus were the hottest and had the least amount of trees that could cool students on a hot summer's day. So what we did is we rated each one of the trees on campus based on their measurements, like how big their canopy is, how tall the tree is, how big the shadow is that it'll throw, how dense the canopy is, how little light it'll let through. And once we had all of those cooling scores, we summarized them for each green space, and then we ranked them. So essentially, this map shows us which areas on campus are the hottest and which areas on campus are going to be the coolest during a heat dome. And we immediately identified Main Mall as a huge hot zone because there's a lot of concrete. And there are trees there, but they're not really over the walkways. And there are some benches, but in general, that spot tends to be very, very hot. I mean, the sun kind of shines down very directly. And when you're walking there, it can get pretty hot. So we found some areas on campus that were quite cool, very dense canopies, creating a microclimate, and some areas that were really hot, surrounded by built environment and concrete. And lastly, when I was just looking at the heat mitigation during my capstone, I realized that if I wanted to do a master's, I was going to have to add something to it. I couldn't just do this. So I thought about it. And when I realized that the way a canopy intercepts UV rays is quite similar to how a canopy intercepts rain, right? Rain and UV rays both come from above, hit the leaves of a canopy, and slowly get filtered out. So my master's thesis essentially is looking at the synergisms between the rainwater interception and heat mitigation within urban trees. So understanding how those ecosystem services might be able to be calculated in unison and together. And then what specific other things do I need to know to fully realize both of these ecosystem services? So an example of a tree, I was thinking for a really long time and I wasn't quite sure which to choose, but then I thought that I realized there's a tree on campus that I might be the only person that truly appreciates it. And that is the main red oak that is planted in the skate park here on campus. It's the only tree on the skate park, and it covers the back end of it. And it's also the only place you can go for shade. So during a heat dome, if you're skating in a concrete skate park, it's like being a fried egg in a skillet. It is so hot. Anytime you fall, it burns, like your skin, it hurts. There's a lot of metal features in a skate park too that get really, really hot. And so when you're moving and you're skating for maybe just 5 minutes, you can't move anymore. You're done. So you got to sit under that tree. And there's only one single tree. So every single skater in the summer is all huddled under this tree because it's the only place that has shade on the whole on the whole skate park. So that's something that I thought was really interesting. And this tree is actually pretty significant to us skaters because, well, not only is it the only place for shade, it's also the only place for shelter from rain when it starts raining. Specifically in the spring when we have those really short showers that almost don't really get the concrete fully wet, that it starts drying up immediately. All of us run under this tree and we just stand there and wait until it stops raining and then we can keep skating. But recently there was construction. So there used to be a basketball court next to the skate park, which was torn out. And now there is, I think, a new sustainable fuel pump. I think it's hydrogen fuel. Not entirely sure. But we were all kind of worried about the tree because the construction goes right up to the tree and they put a tree protection zone around it, but people weren't really respecting it because this was our only access to shade and we still wanted to sit in there. So you can actually see in one of the, maybe you can see in one of the pictures, the tree protection zone, one part of it got torn down. People started to go in it. And yeah, it kind of shows how important access to shade and shelter is for us and for users of an urban environment. And it kind of made me realize that we need to know the feedback from every user to fully understand all the different perspectives of a green space. When we go and we try to evaluate the purpose and the functionality of a green space, we often just ask ourselves. We often we're all urban foresters in the class, so we all have this kind of notion and this idea of what a green space looks like and what the functions of a green space should be, but we need to understand that there are multiple users to every green space, and some things that some users might see, others won't. For instance, I mean, if you give a skateboarder a candle's worth of wax and a parking curb in a parking lot, they can keep themselves busy for like 3 hours and they'll say, this was a great time, this is a great space for me. But no one else has that relationship to the environment that we have. And it might be the same for other people that are that have other sports. So it's really important for us to kind of realize that we have a lot of uses for green spaces. And not only does it provide those regulating ecosystem services I was talking about, but there is a cedar hedge along the length of the skate park, and within it is a huge blackberry bush that is creeping all along the side. And in the summer, when all of those berries are ripe, all the skateboarders, we climb on each other's shoulders and we all pick them, and then we have a huge feast. So I really appreciate those plants as well, and kind of the multifunctionality of the trees of this site. They seem like it's just it's just the oak tree that's growing in the skate park and there's just a bush that's growing there, but it means more to us than it might appear. All right, so we're at the end of the presentation and I wanted to synthesize some of the key takeaways. So I kind of have a takeaway for each one of the topics we covered roughly. So first off is personalizing and visualizing the landscape and history can make our land acknowledgements more meaningful, and they can actually show our gratitude towards the land. Second, trees are an integral part to educational institutions since pretty much their conception, dating all the way back to, the academy, Plato's academy in ancient Greece. Third is that understanding the personal connections we have to nature can heal our human nature divide, and understand that the love for nature that we have is innate. It's been with us since our very first moment. Sometimes we just haven't really grasped it yet. And we need that one experience that really shows us that, yeah, nature has been aside us all along. Four is that storytelling is an incredibly powerful tool to share knowledge, and it's unique because it can adapt to suit different listeners' needs, which I think is very important when trying to convey data or scientific research to people that are interested but might not really have the background. Diversity exists at every scale and is instrumental to the health of the ecosphere. Biodiversity is not just this one metric that we can count all the species and then we have some sort of metric on how healthy the ecosystem is. We have to look at it at every single scale, not only how many plant species are there, but how are those species actually constructed, and how does the canopy stratify itself? How do we have diverse habitat that then also fosters more diversity in species? And lastly, to fully understand every aspect of a green space, we need to hear from every single user, and we need to identify who we haven't asked yet. And that concludes my presentation. And now I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Finn. So are there any questions? Yes, Rhonda.
No, if you're studying green spaces, that is actually including the Colby Botanical Garden, or is it the national park? In terms of diversity.
So the question for those at home was whether or not his study of the green spaces included Natobi Gardens and the Botanical Garden.
So Natobi Garden, we haven't gone to map yet. We tend to focus on areas that provide a certain experience for the students enrolled in the class. Because it's an urban forestry class, we try to target areas that will actually give them that experience of looking at street trees specifically. However, the Botanical Garden does have a study on species diversity, and that data is available to us. So we have looked at it. It's just not in the same format as the rest of the data, but it is key data. And we hope to go out in future to highlight and fully map and identify those areas, specifically Natobi, the rhododendron woods, the totem forest, and also, the botanical gardens, because I mean, they're all part of the landscape and part of campus. So yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna repeat the question,
Yes.
but the question was if we looked at any lichens, mosses, and microflora, fauna for our research. And for the greater project, we didn't, because there isn't a consistent database on campus that kind of shows where everything is, what species are. However, in actual, like for assignments that I've had in biodiversity classes, I have done that. I have gone out to the 2 green spaces that I showed to identify not only what are the trees there, but what does the understory look like? What are the shrubs like? And then what are the mosses like, the grasses, the smaller, really small plants, and even trying to identify a rough count of insects that are there, like microfauna. But there was an initiative by the previous like mapping specialist, Egan Davis. He wanted to start a shrub inventory that would go through campus, similar to the tree inventory, and figure out all the understory species that we have and where they are. However, that proved to be a huge undertaking, and he actually left UBC to work in White Rock, I'm pretty sure. And unfortunately, that project never finished, but there is talk to continue that and try to figure out some of the other species that are around us. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's really important that we understand the full scope of our urban forest, and that we don't, because I mean, we call it urban forestry, right? And a forest is more than just the trees that stand there. It's the whole system and figuring out all of the different actors that are part of it. If it were up to me, and we had unlimited budget and we could just have a bunch of employees that go around and experts that can identify everything, I'd love to do a database. But unfortunately, things like that are incredibly hard, especially because, as you said, lichen is incredibly diverse and it's everywhere on trees, and often we don't even know it's there because it's so high up in the canopy, or sometimes there's 2 or 3 different species of lichen on one tree. So it's kind of hard, but I hope in future that there's going to be more research on that. We always are hoping to expand our data repository.
I think we have time for only one more question.
Then there's some great comments
Oh.
on the chat as well. Maria said the presentation touched my mind and my heart. Interesting, educational, and beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, I see here. There's a question. I'll answer one of the questions from here then. Okay. Yeah. So the question is cities. Okay. Yeah. So it's kind of a 2-part question here. Yes. But I haven't really been working with local cities yet.
What's the question?
Oh, okay. So the question is, am I working with local cities yet? A lot of density additions are being planned, but I haven't really heard anything from cities about protecting or modifying existing green ecosystems along with said densification. Yeah, I haven't really worked with any local cities yet. I hope to soon, especially as part of my master's. Right now, I'm looking at UBC because UBC is a very unique setting, right? We are a university, but more than that, we're kind of our own little city, right? We have Westbrook, we have almost all of our amenities on Point Grey, and we have this incredible data repository for all the trees we have on campus. So I've been mainly focused on that. However, I am trying to look at green spaces outside of UBC and try to identify some of the most common ones and see if I can somehow emulate them here on campus by finding spots on campus that look like, let's say, the street trees on 16th or the smaller, very concrete pocket parks like Pigeon Park in the downtown east side. Things like that, trying to figure out how we can look and analyze those kind of green spaces and trees that aren't necessarily on campus, but are similar on campus, will hopefully let me kind of expand the scope of my research a little bit. But yeah, I mean, densification isn't only an issue in the city, right? Like Westbrook is set to expand, and I mean, UBC is constantly under construction somewhere. So it's kind of a very campus issue as well. So I haven't really focused on outside yet, but I think it'll come, and hopefully I can kind of expand my research a bit.
Thank you so much, Finn. I was just saying to him earlier that I would love to take one of his tours. And I have been out on campus either as a student or working out here for more decades than I want to think about. But honestly, it has been completely transformed since I was a student. And what was really interesting that you were mentioning your surprise about the students being sensitive to trees being cut down, and so much construction. It's become so urban since I was a student. And honestly, campus planning would cut down trees on the weekends, Sunday mornings when nobody was around, and we weren't told about this. You know, it's just becomes, if you had done that inventory 50 years ago, you would have had it really was more of a forest than a university.
Mm-hmm.
It was a few buildings among the trees, and and a lot of the plantings, the understory, the shrubbery, it's all very, I mean, it's not diverse at all. And they've taken down a lot of the really big trees. It's very difficult to see that transformation in such a short period of time. So it's really great that you're doing this work now, and extremely valuable. And I think it was, as one of the people at home mentioned, with the densification of the city, I wonder what's going to happen to a lot of our trees.
Mhm,
So,
yeah,
so important, really valuable. Thank you so much, Ben.
thank you for having me.